He divorced his invisible wife. Then a mafia king's private jet came to bring her home. He slid the papers across the marble table like they were nothing, like she was nothing. 3 years of marriage, and Damon Cross couldn't even be bothered to look up from his phone when he ended it. "Sign them," he said. "Your things will be packed by morning." Seraphine Vale, his wife, in name if nothing else, looked at the papers for exactly 4 seconds. Then she picked up the pen and signed without a tremor in her hand, without a single word of protest, without one tear threatening to fall. She walked out of the penthouse at 9:47 in the morning. By 10:15, the Manhattan skyline had a new silhouette, a black and gold Boeing business jet, the kind that doesn't appear on any civilian flight tracker, banked low over Midtown and descended under federal clearance that nobody could explain and nobody dared question. 12 armored vehicles materialized from 3 directions simultaneously, sealing off 6 city blocks. Men in dark suits with earpieces and dead eyes stood at intersections while NYPD officers stepped back without being asked. A man stepped onto the tarmac, tall, unhurried, the kind of quiet that precedes catastrophe. He said 4 words to the closest aide, and those 4 words traveled up the chain of every intelligence agency that had been monitoring his movements across 2 continents for the better part of a decade. "Bring my sister home." In an office tower 41 floors above the street, Damon Cross finally put down his phone. If you've ever watched something irreplaceable walk out your door while you stood there doing absolutely nothing, drop a comment below with your city. Tell me where you're watching from, because this story is going to reach further than I ever imagined, and I want to know how far. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and do not go anywhere, because what comes next will change everything you thought you understood about this woman, this marriage, and what it truly costs to be invisible. The morning had started the way most mornings did in the Cross penthouse, cold, efficient, and hollow. Seraphine had been awake since 5. Not because she had anywhere important to be, but because she had never quite learned to sleep past the hour, when the city was still gray, and the silence felt less like peace and more like held breath. She'd made coffee, 2 cups, out of habit, even though Damon had stopped drinking the second cup she left on his side of the counter 18 months ago. She'd poured it down the drain before he came downstairs, the way she always did, the small daily erasure of a gesture that had stopped meaning anything. Damon appeared at 7:40, already in his suit, already with his phone in his hand. He didn't say good morning. She didn't expect him to. He moved through the kitchen like she was a piece of furniture he'd learned to navigate around, not with hostility exactly, but with the specific indifference of a man who had simply stopped registering her presence as something that required acknowledgement. He poured his own coffee. She watched him for a moment, this man she had married 3 years ago in a ceremony that lasted 40 minutes, and produced exactly 0 photographs that either family had displayed publicly. He was handsome in a way that cameras loved and people noticed before they noticed anything else about him. Strong jaw, dark eyes, the kind of posture that comes from decades of being told you matter. He had never been cruel to her. She wanted to be clear about that, at least in her own mind. He had never raised his voice, never belittled her, never done any of the things that would have made the situation easier to categorize. He had simply been absent, consistently, completely, professionally absent. She had learned early that pointing this out accomplished nothing. The one time, 8 months into the marriage, when she had sat across from him at dinner and asked, not with accusation, just with genuine and exhausted curiosity, whether he thought they might ever have an actual conversation that lasted longer than logistical necessity, he had looked up from his laptop with genuine confusion on his face. Not guilt, not discomfort, just confusion, as if the question itself didn't map onto any framework he possessed. "We talk," he'd said. "About the apartment," she'd replied. "About whether the car service is coming at 7 or 7:15. He'd looked at her for another moment, and then he'd looked back at his screen, and she'd understood something then that she'd spent the following 2 years quietly confirming. He wasn't keeping her at a distance out of malice. He simply did not think about her at all, which was, in some ways, worse. So she had built a life inside the margins of his indifference. She read extensively. She developed opinions about architecture and urban water systems and the structural failures of mid-century housing policy that she shared with precisely no one in his social circle, because they would not have known what to do with her. She kept the penthouse in a kind of quiet order that he neither noticed nor appreciated. She attended the functions she was expected to attend, stood at the correct angle in photographs, said the correct things to the correct people, and returned home each evening to the vast, beautiful apartment that had never once felt like hers. She was not unhappy, exactly. She was something more precise than that. She was suspended. Waiting, though she couldn't have named what she was waiting for. She found out at 9:40 on a Tuesday morning in October. He came into the living room with an envelope she hadn't seen before, and he set it on the marble coffee table with a finality that she recognized before she understood what she was looking at. "I need you to sign these," he said. She picked up the envelope, opened it, processed the language of the first page with the specific, slow clarity that comes when your mind is trying to protect you from the speed of what's happening. Divorce papers. Prepared. Filed. Ready. "When did you—" she started. "6 weeks ago," he said. He still wasn't looking at her. He was standing at the window, hands in his pockets, watching the street 41 floors below with the expression of a man reviewing a quarterly report. "I should have addressed this sooner. The arrangement hasn't served either of us, and there's no point in continuing it." The arrangement. 3 years of her life, and that was the word he chose. The arrangement. She sat with the papers on her lap for a moment. She thought, and she would remember this later, in a hotel room with her brother's hand on her shoulder and the skyline burning, that there was no part of her that was surprised. The only thing that surprised her was herself, the absence of devastation. She had loved him, or something adjacent to love, in the first year, the careful, contingent kind of love that grows in cold climates because it has nothing else to do. But somewhere in the second year it had shifted into something quieter and more durable, a kind of fundamental sorrow for him, for what he was, for what it must be like to move through the world touching nothing. She picked up the pen from the coffee table. She signed her name on every required line. She set the pen down. "Your building manager will coordinate the removal of your personal items," Damon said, still at the window. "There's no need for—" "I don't have very much," she said. That was true. She had come to his penthouse with 2 suitcases and a box of books. She had accumulated in 3 years almost nothing beyond what she'd arrived with. She had not redecorated, had not filled the closets, had not in any material sense expanded into the space she'd been given. She had taken up precisely as much room as she'd been invited to occupy, which was very little. She stood up. She set the papers on the table. She walked to the bedroom, retrieved the single bag she had packed 4 days ago, because she had known, somehow, even if she hadn't known she'd known, and she walked back through the living room. Damon had turned from the window. For one moment, and it was only one, something moved across his face. She couldn't have named it. He couldn't have named it. It was gone before either of them could examine it. "Seraphine," he said. "It's all right," she said, and she meant it, which was the saddest thing about the sentence. "Take care of yourself, Damon." She walked out. The elevator took 40 seconds to reach the lobby. She counted them. On the street, a black SUV was already waiting at the curb. She recognized the driver, Marcus, who had been her personal driver for 3 years, who she had assumed was employed by Damon's household staff. He was out of the car before she reached the door, and the expression on his face was not the careful professional neutrality she had always attributed to good service training. It was relief, raw and unguarded and out of place. "Miss Vale," he said, "we're ready." "Ready for what?" she asked. He didn't answer. He opened the door. She got in because she didn't know what else to do, and because something in his face made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could measure, that someone knew exactly where she was. The SUV didn't take her to a hotel or to an attorney's office or to any of the places her mind mapped automatically. It took her to JFK, to a private terminal she had no knowledge of, through 3 separate security checkpoints staffed by men who waved them through without looking at identification. She understood that she should be asking questions. She understood that this situation was unusual in ways that warranted alarm. But she sat in the back of that SUV with her bag on her lap and watched the city move past the tinted windows and felt, underneath the confusion, something she hadn't felt in years. The strange animal certainty of being wanted somewhere. The terminal was clean and quiet and small, a single gate, a single aircraft. The black and gold Boeing business jet on the tarmac was not subtle. It was the specific kind of conspicuousness that comes from an entity powerful enough not to care who notices. She stared at it through the terminal window for a long moment. Then she heard him. She heard his voice before she turned. She would always know that voice, low and deliberate, the voice that had read her fairy tales in a language she'd since had to teach herself to forget. She turned around. Lucian Draven stood 10 feet away from her with his hands clasped behind his back and his dark eyes on her face. And for a single unguarded moment, he looked like someone had hit him. "Sarah," he said. She hadn't been called that in 12 years. Something cracked open in her chest. She wasn't sure what it was. She wasn't sure she could name it without sitting down somewhere quiet for several hours and taking it apart piece by piece. But she crossed the terminal floor in 6 steps, and her brother's arms came around her, and she stood there with her face against the shoulder of the most feared man in 3 continents, and she allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to be somewhere that someone had built specifically to hold her. "I'm sorry," he said into her hair. "I'm sorry it took this long." "You're here now," she said. That was all. That was enough. She didn't know yet what was coming. She didn't know that the divorce papers she had signed an hour ago had triggered a series of events that had been waiting, coiled, and patient for exactly this moment. She didn't know about the traitor inside Damon's corporation. She didn't know about the mercenaries. She didn't know that the assassination attempt from 12 years ago, the night that had scattered her life into pieces so small she'd spent a decade collecting them, had never actually ended. She didn't know any of that yet. But Lucien did. And somewhere across the city, on the 41st floor of a tower that had been quietly, systematically held together by a woman he had never once truly looked at, Damon Cross was pulling up financial records he had always taken for granted and beginning, for the first time, to read them. The numbers were extraordinary. The numbers were impossible. The numbers all traced back to a single anonymous source that had been rerouting capital, arranging emergency acquisitions, and silently preventing the collapse of his empire at least 11 separate times over the past 3 years, beginning 6 weeks before their wedding and continuing through every significant crisis his company had faced, right up to and including a hostile takeover attempt 4 months ago that he had attributed to his own strategic brilliance. He sat at his desk with the records spread across 3 screens and tried to find the thread that connected all of it. He found it. He pushed back from the desk. He stood at the window where, an hour and 15 minutes ago, he had watched the city below while his wife, his now former wife, signed her name to the end of their marriage. His phone rang. His head of security. He picked up. "Mr. Cross?" The man's voice was strange, tight in a way he hadn't heard before. "There's a situation at JFK." "What kind of situation?" "Federal airspace clearance situation, the kind that doesn't come through normal channels." A pause. "Sir, do you know who Lucian Draven is?" Damon's hand tightened on the phone. Everyone knew who Lucian Draven was. You didn't operate at his level in New York financial circles without knowing, at minimum, the name. A ghost in the machine of global organized crime, a man whose actual power was more theoretical than documented because no documentation ever seemed to survive the filing process. An intelligence profile that Interpol and 3 separate federal agencies had been adding to for 11 years without producing a single actionable charge. "Why?" Damon said. "Because his aircraft just landed at JFK, his security chief said. And the woman he's escorting to it," Damon was already moving toward the elevator, "was identified by terminal security as your wife." He stopped. "My former wife," he said, because the papers were right there on the table, signed, complete, and because some part of his brain was still operating in the mode that prioritized technical accuracy over the thing currently happening in his chest. "Mr. Cross," his security chief said carefully, "I think you need to understand something. Those anonymous investments we've been trying to trace for the past 18 months. "I know," Damon said. A silence. "You know?" "I just figured it out," Damon said. 20 minutes ago. I just sat here and figured it out." He stood in the middle of his living room with the phone at his ear and the divorce papers on the table and the skyline outside the floor-to-ceiling windows going gray with the particular light of a New York October morning, and he thought about a woman who had moved through his home like a ghost for 3 years and somehow, without him ever noticing, built the foundation everything he owned was standing on. He had called her invisible. He had thought that was simply what she was. He hadn't considered, not once, not for a single moment, that invisible was what she had chosen to be. "Get me a car," he said. "Sir, get me a car," he said again. "Right now." He grabbed his keys from the counter. He took 3 steps toward the door. Then he stopped, because he didn't actually know what he was going to do when he got there. What would he say to her? That he'd looked at some numbers and now he understood that she was important? That the financial records had achieved in 20 minutes what 3 years of living in the same space had failed to accomplish? He stood at the door of his apartment for a long moment. Then his phone buzzed with a message from his security chief. 3 words, no punctuation, the kind of brevity that means there's no time for anything else. Runway. Armed men. He ran. 41 floors down through the lobby, into the car that pulled up before he'd even cleared the building entrance. The driver pushed the accelerator to the floor and said nothing, and Damon watched the city blur past the windows and tried to calculate how badly he had misjudged everything. He was still calculating when the first explosion lit up the sky to the southeast. The explosion didn't come from the runway itself. It came from the eastern perimeter fence, a controlled detonation, shaped and deliberate, the kind that announces professional presence rather than amateur desperation. Damon felt it before he heard it, a low concussive pressure that moved through the floor of the car and up through his sternum, and the driver, to his credit, didn't flinch. Just pressed harder on the accelerator and said, through clenched teeth, 2 minutes, sir. 2 minutes felt like an insult to the situation. Damon's phone was ringing. 3 different numbers in rotation. His head of security, his legal counsel, and a 4th number he didn't recognize that had called twice in the past 90 seconds with a Manhattan area code he couldn't place. I ignored all of them and pulled up the terminal map his security chief had sent 20 minutes ago, trying to orient himself to a geography that was changing faster than any map could track. What he knew, Seraphine was at a private terminal on the JFK South End. What he knew, Lucian Draven, whose name made federal agencies careful about their paperwork, was with her. What he knew, someone with access to military-grade ordnance had just announced their presence on the perimeter of a civilian airport in the middle of a Tuesday morning. What he didn't know was the most important thing, whether any of this was his fault. He was starting to think it was. The car turned hard onto the service road that ran parallel to the south terminal, and Damon saw the smoke before he saw anything else. A thick black column rising from the fence line. The kind that meant accelerant. The kind that meant planning. 3 of Lucien's armored vehicles had repositioned to form a wedge in front of the terminal entrance, and between them and the smoke, there were men moving in patterns that were not random, tactical, coordinated. The specific choreography of people who had rehearsed for this. The driver brought the car to a hard stop 200 yards short of the terminal entrance, because there were 2 men standing in the middle of the road who were clearly not going to move, and who were clearly armed in ways that suggested the driver's instinct to stop was the correct one. "I need to get through," Damon said. "Mr. Cross?" One of the men approached the window, which the driver lowered halfway. The man was broad, composed, and looked at Damon with the particular expression of someone assessing a complication rather than a person. "Mr. Draven is aware you're here. Then let me through." "That decision," the man said, "isn't mine." The radio on the man's hip crackled. A voice Damon couldn't make out said something brief, and the man's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not relaxing exactly, but recalibrating. "Follow on foot," the man said. "Leave your phone in the vehicle." "That's not Mr. Cross." The man looked at him steadily. "You're at a perimeter that my employer controls. You will follow on foot, or you will go back the way you came. Those are the options available to you." Damon looked at the smoke. He looked at the terminal. He put his phone on the seat beside him, got out of the car, and followed the man on foot down the service road toward whatever came next. He had not asked Seraphine what she wanted in 3 years of marriage. He figured the least he could do now was walk toward her without negotiating the terms. The inside of the terminal was organized chaos, the kind that looks random until you understand that every person in it knows exactly where they're supposed to be. Lucien's people moved through the space with an economy of motion that Damon recognized from his own best operations teams, the specific efficiency of people who have been trained to a standard most professionals never reach. There were 12 of them that he could count, likely more he couldn't. Lucien himself was at the far end of the terminal near the gate window, speaking quietly into a headset with his back to the room. He was taller than Damon had expected, not physically imposing in any theatrical sense, but the kind of tall that comes with absolute stillness, the height of a man who has never needed to make himself bigger in a room. He turned when Damon was 10 feet away, and he looked at him the way a man looks at a structural deficiency he has been monitoring from a distance for long enough to have an opinion about. He ended the call without saying goodbye. "You came," Lucian said. "Where is she?" Damon said. "Safe. For the moment." Lucien tilted his head toward the windows, where the aircraft was still on the tarmac, surrounded now by a second ring of vehicles that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. "We have a problem with the runway. Someone cut the lights on the south approach. Deliberate, professional." He paused. "Which tells me they've been planning this since before you served her the papers this morning." The sentence landed with precision. Damon didn't flinch, because flinching would have cost him the only ground he had. "You're saying someone knew she was leaving today?" "I'm saying," Lucian said, "that someone inside your organization has been providing operational intelligence to an entity that has been trying to kill my sister for 12 years. And whatever timetable they were operating on just accelerated." He crossed his arms. "So, yes, we have a problem." "She never told me," Damon said. He heard how it sounded. He said it anyway. "She never told me who she was." Lucian looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said. "She didn't. And you never asked." The difference between those two sentences was a canyon, and they both knew it. Damon didn't try to argue across it. "I need to see her," he said. "She doesn't need to see you," Lucian said flatly. "She needs to be on that aircraft and in the air and away from this city and every person in it who has failed to do one single thing to keep her safe for 3 years. His voice didn't rise. It never rose. The flatness of it was worse than volume. "But she asked. 30 seconds after Marcus told her you'd followed. She asked if you were here." He looked away toward the window. "So you have 5 minutes, and then I need you gone, because your presence here is a liability I did not budget for this morning." He gestured toward a door at the side of the terminal. Damon went through it. The room beyond was small and functionally furnished. A table, 4 chairs, fluorescent light. Seraphine was sitting in the chair farthest from the door with a paper cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, and she looked up when he came in. He had seen her look up when he entered rooms for 3 years. This was different. Her eyes were steady in a way that he had categorized, throughout their marriage, as composure. He understood now that it wasn't composure. It was something harder and more deliberate than composure. It was a woman who had learned, at significant personal cost, to let nothing show that she couldn't afford to have seen. He sat down across from her. He had nothing prepared, which was unusual for him, and he felt the discomfort of it in a way he wasn't accustomed to. He was a man who prepared for every conversation of consequence, who had his position established before he walked into any room. He had nothing here. He hadn't had time to prepare, and if he was honest, the preparation wouldn't have helped, because the problem wasn't strategic. The problem was that he had spent 3 years being wrong about something fundamental, and no preparation survives that. "You should have told me," he said. She looked at him. "Told you what specifically?" "Any of it." "Which part?" she said. "The part where I was hidden because someone tried to shoot me when I was 19? Or the part where I've been quietly managing your company's financial survival for the past 3 years? Which disclosure do you think would have gone over better?" Her voice was calm. Completely, unsettlingly calm. Not because she was suppressing something. He had seen her suppress things, knew what that looked like, the particular tension around her jaw, but because she had apparently made her peace with the situation before he walked in the room, which meant she was already somewhere he hadn't caught up to yet. "Both," he said. "Either. Something, Seraphine." "I tried," she said simply. "In the beginning, I asked you, 8 months in, whether we might have an actual conversation sometime." He remembered. He had looked up from his laptop. He had said, "We talk." He remembered that too. "I didn't understand what you were asking," he said. "I know," she said. "That was the problem. There was no accusation in it. That was the thing that made it hardest. She said it the way you state a fact about geography, about the way a city is laid out, about distance between 2 points. Not angrily. Not with the satisfaction of a score being settled. Just plainly, the way you describe something you've had a long time to look at clearly." "Those investments," he said. She waited. 11 separate interventions in 3 years, he said. The Caldwell acquisition, The Meridian litigation. The hostile takeover in June, he paused. That was you. The Caldwell acquisition was your idea, she said. I just made sure the counterparty didn't pull out before you closed it. The litigation I managed because the opposing counsel had a conflict of interest that your team had missed, and I had 3 days to resolve it quietly before it became public. The takeover, she picked up the coffee cup, looked at it, put it down. That one was more complicated. Why, he said. Why any of it? She looked at him with something that might have been patience if it weren't also a little bit like grief. Because it was the right thing to do, she said. Because your company employs 4,000 people who had nothing to do with the terms of our marriage. Because I was there, and I could see what was happening, and doing nothing while watching preventable damage occur is not something I'm capable of. She paused. And because for about 6 months in the first year, I thought that if I helped enough, you might… She stopped herself, shook her head very slightly. That doesn't matter now. It matters, he said. Damon. She said his name the way you say the name of someone you have accepted as a completed thing. There are armed men on the perimeter of this airport who have been waiting for me for 12 years. My brother is 40 feet from this room, managing the kind of logistics that your worst nightmare doesn't have vocabulary for. This is not the moment. When is the moment? He said. Because you're about to get on a plane and I don't… You don't what? She finally looked at him with something that had an edge to it, and perversely it was easier than the calm, because at least it was movement. You don't want to lose me? You lost me, Damon. You lost me while I was standing in your kitchen pouring out the second cup of coffee. You lost me on every night. You worked until 2 in the morning in the same apartment I was in and didn't once come find me. You lost me in increments so small that neither of us noticed until there was nothing left to lose. She stopped. Her jaw was set. The papers I signed this morning didn't change anything. They just made official what had been true for a long time. He had no answer to that. There wasn't one. The door opened without a knock. One of Lucian's men, not the one from the road, a different one, younger, with a radio pressed to his ear, leaned in and said, "Ma'am, we need to move. They've cut communication with the tower." Seraphine stood immediately. Damon stood too, the automatic instinct of a man who doesn't know what to do but needs to do something. "Go back to your building," Seraphine said. "Lock it down. Call Harmon at the FBI. His direct line, not the main office. Tell him Gideon Cross has been running a secondary operation through Cross Financial for at least 7 years and that you want protection." She picked up her bag. "He'll know what it means." He stared at her. "Gideon? My Uncle Gideon?" She looked at him for exactly 1 second, and something in that second was almost tender. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know that's… How long have you known?" "Since last year," she said. "I've been building documentation. Lucian has it." She moved toward the door. "Damon, call Harmon. Do it from a landline, not your cell, and don't go home first." Then she was through the door, and the room was empty, and he was standing in a fluorescent-lit room in a private terminal at JFK, with the specific feeling of a man who has just had the correct map handed to him 3 years too late. He stood there for 4 seconds. Then he went back through the door into the main terminal. Lucien was still at the window. He watched Damon cross the room and stopped him with a single sentence, delivered without turning around. "She saved your company 11 times. "I know," Damon said. "She intercepted 2 separate intelligence leaks from inside your executive team that would have exposed you to federal securities investigation." He paused. "She did it without telling you, because telling you would have required explaining how she knew, and explaining how she knew would have required telling you who she was, and she didn't think you'd want to know." Damon said nothing. "She didn't think," Lucien said, finally turning, "that she was worth the explanation. That is what 3 years in your orbit produced. My sister, who survived a professional assassination attempt at 19 and rebuilt herself from the ground up in a city where no one knew her name, came to believe she was not worth a conversation." His voice was entirely level. The levelness of it was the most frightening thing about him. "So when you feel the urge to be angry at me for the decisions I made about her protection, I'd encourage you to sit with that for a while before you say anything you mean." Damon looked at him. "I'm not angry at you," he said. Lucian's eyes held his for a moment, assessing, and then he nodded once, the minimal acknowledgement of a man who doesn't waste gestures. "She told you about Gideon?" Damon asked. "She told me everything," Lucian said. 11 months ago, I've been building the case since then, waiting for a clean moment. He turned back to the window. Your uncle has been running a secondary financial intelligence operation from inside your company for 7 years, feeding proprietary information to a cartel network that has been trying to locate Seraphine since she disappeared. Your marriage was, from his perspective, an opportunity. Access to Seraphine's location, her identity, her patterns. He thought if he could isolate her, manufacture a divorce, remove Lucian's informal protection. He set up the marriage? Damon said. No. Lucian's jaw tightened. I arranged the marriage. I thought you were safe. I thought the cross name provided structural protection. Visible, deniable, clean. I didn't know about Gideon's secondary operation when I approved it. A pause. Waited. That is a failure I will carry for some time. The radio on the table crackled. A voice said 3 words, and Lucien was moving before the third one finished. They're at the east gate, he said. 12, maybe 15. Suppressed weapons. 2 vehicles. He pulled a phone from his jacket and dialed without looking. We're moving in 90 seconds. I'm coming, Damon said. Lucien stopped, looked at him. You have no training for this. I have motivation, Damon said, which is something. The look Lucien gave him was not warm. It was not unkind either. It was the look of a man making a rapid and unsentimental calculation. Stay behind my people, he said. Don't touch anything. Don't make decisions. If I tell you to get down, you get down without thinking about it first. He picked up the radio. And understand that if you slow us down or create a problem, I will leave you exactly where you are. Understood, Damon said. The next 4 minutes were the most disorienting of his life. He had thought, because he moved comfortably in rooms where significant things were decided, that he understood high-pressure operations. He had sat in boardrooms where billions of dollars changed hands and held his position under sophisticated and sustained pressure. He had believed this gave him a particular kind of stability. It did not prepare him for moving through a private terminal in a tactical formation while a suppressed gunfight happened 40 meters to his left. He couldn't see the gunfight. He could hear it. The specific, flat, percussive sound of suppressed weapons was nothing like he'd expected, less dramatic and somehow more alarming for it. The sound of professional violence conducted at close range by people who had done it before. Lucian's men moved around him like water around a rock, constant and purposeful, communicating in a clipped shorthand that he couldn't follow. He focused on staying within the moving perimeter they'd established around him, and not becoming a problem, which was the most humbling objective he had set for himself in recent memory. They reached the aircraft stairs. Seraphine was already at the top, and she looked down as he came across the tarmac, and the expression on her face when she saw him was complicated in a way he didn't have time to read. Lucien was behind him. Move, he said, and Damon moved, and he went up the stairs and into the aircraft because there was nothing else to do, and the stairs retracted behind him with a hydraulic finality that sounded like a door closing on the last 3 years of his life. He didn't know yet that Gideon had been watching the terminal from the 3rd floor of a hotel half a mile from the airport. He didn't know that Gideon's plan had always depended on Damon staying away, that Damon's presence on the aircraft had just broken a sequence of events that Gideon had engineered over 7 years with meticulous patience. He didn't know that, somewhere in the intelligence documentation Lucian's team had assembled over 11 months, there was a file with his name on it, not as a suspect, but as the single variable that Gideon had never been able to fully control because Gideon had underestimated something about his nephew, and that miscalculation was about to cost him everything. The aircraft began to move. Damon sat in a seat across the narrow aisle from Seraphine, who was watching the window, and he thought about a coffee cup being poured down a drain every morning for 18 months, and what kind of man lets that happen without noticing, and whether the kind of man who lets that happen is the kind of man who can do anything about it now. His phone was in the car. He had left it in the car. Harmon's call would have to wait. Lucien emerged from the front of the cabin. His headset was still on. His face had a quality Damon hadn't seen on it yet, a tightness around the eyes, something that in a less controlled man would have been fear, and in Lucien read as the very close management of something that could become fear if he allowed it room. He looked at Seraphine, not at Damon. "They're not at the east gate anymore," he said. She went still. "Where?" she said. Lucien looked at the floor for exactly 1 second. the specific, brief, self-permitted pause of a man delivering news he has been dreading, and said, "The runway." The aircraft stopped moving. Outside the windows, the lights on the south approach went dark one by one, like something blinking out, and in the sudden blackness, Seraphine reached across the aisle and put her hand on the armrest of Damon's seat. Not on his hand, not quite, just on the armrest, just close enough that he could feel the warmth of it, and said, in a voice that was completely steady and completely terrifying in its steadiness, "Lucien, they knew the route." "Yes," Lucien said. "They knew before this morning. Yes." "Then it's someone on your side," she said, "or someone on his." 3 sets of eyes in a dark cabin at the end of a runway that was no longer lit. And somewhere in the hotel room half a mile away, Gideon Cross looked at his phone, read the message from his contact inside Lucien's organization, and allowed himself, for the first time in 7 years of careful patience, to smile. The cabin lights flickered once and held. Outside the windows, the runway remained dark. Not the gradual dark of a power issue. Not the rolling kind that comes from blown equipment, but the immediate, absolute dark of a system that had been switched off by someone who knew exactly which switch to hit. Lucien stood in the aisle with his hand braced against the overhead panel and his headset pressed to his ear, listening to something that was making the muscle in his jaw work in slow, controlled pulses. Seraphine had not moved her hand from the armrest. Damon had not moved at all. The aircraft had stopped 40 meters short of the runway threshold. The pilots were talking to each other in the cockpit in voices too low to reach the cabin. Someone in the front of the plane was on a radio. Someone at the back had produced a weapon from somewhere and was standing at the rear emergency door with the particular stillness of a man who is not checking whether something will happen, but deciding how to respond when it does. Lucien pulled the headset down around his neck. "We have a vehicle blocking the south end," he said. "1 vehicle, 2 occupants. They're not moving." He looked at Seraphine. "They're not trying to breach. They're holding position." "They're waiting," she said. "For what?" She said nothing for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds Damon watched her process something. Not slowly, not with visible effort, but with the specific internal speed of someone who has spent years thinking 3 moves ahead of a threat they could never fully name. Then she said, "They're waiting for confirmation that we're contained. The runway block is not the main operation. It's the signal that the main operation is in position." Lucien stared at her. "Where?" he said. "Not here." She finally pulled her hand back from the armrest and pressed it flat against her own knee. "They don't want it here. Too public. Too many variables." She looked up at him. "They want us to get off the plane." The radio at the back of the cabin burst into sharp, overlapping voices, and the man at the rear door straightened and called forward. In the shorthand. Damon still couldn't decode, and Lucien turned toward the cockpit with 3 long strides and disappeared through the door. Damon looked at Seraphine. "Tell me what I can do," he said. She looked at him for a moment, not unkindly, but with the frank assessment of someone who doesn't have time to be diplomatic. "Can you handle a firearm?" "I've trained," he said. "Not recently." "How not recently?" 4 years? She nodded, the nod of a woman filing a piece of information in a category marked marginal but noted. "Stay close to me. Don't interpret anything you see as something you need to fix. And if Lucien's people move, you move with them, not toward whatever drew their attention." "I know," he said. "He told me." "I'm telling you again," she said, "because Lucien told you out of operational necessity, and I'm telling you because I'd prefer you didn't die in the next 30 minutes. He looked at her. "Would you?" Something crossed her face that she didn't entirely suppress. Quick, involuntary, the expression of a woman ambushed by a question she'd already decided not to answer. Then it was gone. "This isn't the moment," she said. The same words as before, back in the terminal room. But they sounded different now, in the dark cabin, with the runway lights out and the city invisible beyond the windows. Less like a door closing, more like one left slightly open. Lucien came back from the cockpit. He stood in the aisle and looked at his sister, and the quality of the look was the thing that told Damon, before any words did, that what came next was going to be bad. "Reyes is gone," Lucien said. The name meant nothing to Damon. To Seraphine it meant everything. He could see it in the way her body changed, the subtle shift of someone absorbing a blow they had just enough warning to brace for. "Gone how?" she said. Van Holt got a signal from his tracker 15 minutes ago. Last position was the hotel on the South Service Road, the one with sightlines to this terminal. He paused. There's blood in the room. Enough. And a secondary phone that wasn't his, with one outgoing message sent in the last hour. To whom? She said. Lucien's jaw set. To Gideon Cross. The name fell into the cabin like something dropped from height. Damon heard it land somewhere in the center of his chest. Reyes, he said. Who is Reyes to you? Lucien looked at him, not with hostility, with the specific reluctance of a man about to hand over information he'd spent considerable effort protecting. He was my head of internal intelligence, he said. He has been with my organization for 9 years. He is the man who built the surveillance infrastructure that has kept Seraphine alive and undetected for the past 12. A pause. He is also, apparently, the source that has been feeding Seraphine's location data, movement patterns, and operational schedule to Gideon Cross's network for the past 11 months. Seraphine stood up. She didn't say anything. She stood up, moved to the window, pressed one hand flat against the cold glass, and stood with her back to the cabin. Her shoulders were absolutely still. Damon understood, watching her, that the stillness was not composure. It was the specific physical discipline of a woman who had just learned that the person responsible for keeping her safe had been the primary instrument of putting her in danger, and who was processing that knowledge in the way you process a wound in a situation where you cannot stop moving, by compressing it, applying direct pressure, and deciding to feel it later or not at all. 11 months, she said to the window. That's when I told you about Gideon. Yes, Lucien said. I told you in your office in Geneva, she said. Reyes was in the building. He was not in the room, Lucien said. He didn't need to be in the room, she said. She turned around. Her face was completely composed in the way a surface is composed after the object beneath it has been removed. He needed to be in the building. Your office has 4 audio vulnerabilities that I identified 18 months ago and flagged to your security team. She looked at her brother. Did they patch them? The pause before Lucien answered was the most terrible silence Damon had ever sat inside. Reyes managed the security upgrades, Lucien said. Seraphine nodded once, the nod of a woman who has just confirmed a thing she desperately wished she had been wrong about. So everything I told you, she said, everything about Gideon, the documentation, the financial intelligence, the timeline, Reyes heard it, and Reyes told Gideon. She sat back down. Her voice was entirely flat, not with suppressed emotion, but with the specific flatness of someone who has moved beyond emotion into pure function. Which means Gideon has known for 11 months that we were building a case. Every step we took, he saw. Every piece of evidence we gathered, he countered. The operation tonight, the fence detonation, the runway block, the timing. It wasn't reactive. It was prepared. She looked at Lucien. He let us build the case. He let us get to the airport. He wanted us all in one location. The silence that followed had a weight to it. Damon's mind was running the parallel track that his mind always ran in a crisis. Operational, structural, causative. He was thinking about Gideon, about his uncle's face at Christmas dinners, at company milestones, at the boardroom table where Damon had presented growth projections, and Gideon had sat to his left with a pen in his hand and asked precisely the right questions, always precisely the right questions, the questions of a man who already knew the answers and was performing the exercise of not knowing them. 7 years. Gideon had been running a parallel operation for 7 years inside Damon's own company, using resources that Damon had built, money that moved through Damon's accounts, people who reported to Damon's organizational chart. And then it hit him. Not gradually. All at once, the specific and nauseating totality of it. Harrington, he said. Both of them looked at him. My CFO, Marcus Harrington. He said it slowly, because he needed to hear it outside of his own head to know if it was true. He's been with Cross Financial for 6 years. Gideon brought him in. I thought it was a referral. Standard. Harrington has access to every financial account, every fund movement, every... He stopped. He's the one who processed the anonymous investments. Every one of them. They all moved through his desk. Seraphine's eyes changed. He knew, she said. It wasn't a question. He had to, Damon said. Nobody moves that volume through a CFO's desk without the CFO knowing what he's looking at. Did he know it was me? She said. I don't know. He looked at her. But he knew it was anonymous. He knew it was irregular. And he never flagged it, never questioned it, never brought it to me. He ran a hand through his hair. He's been in that position since before our marriage. If Gideon placed him, then Gideon knew about the investments, Lucian said. And he didn't stop them, Seraphine said. She said it slowly, like someone reading a text in a language they're still learning to trust. He knew I was protecting the company. He knew what I was doing for Damon, and he let me do it. She paused. Why? The question sat in the cabin, and then Damon answered it, because the answer had arrived in his mind with the cold clarity of something that has always been true. Because he needed the company to be worth something, he said. If Cross Financial failed, the network he was running through it collapsed. He needed it solvent, he needed it visible, and he needed it healthy enough that nobody was looking too closely at the accounts. He looked at Seraphine. You were keeping it alive, so he let you. He used you to protect his own operation. She looked at him for a long moment. And then, she said, when he decided the timing was right, he arranged the divorce to remove me from the building, concentrated all of us here, and… She stopped. Lucien finished it. And he takes the company, takes the network, and eliminates the only two people who can testify to what he's been running. He looked between them. Both of you. Not just Sarah. Both of you. The rear of the plane erupted. Not an explosion. A breach. The rear emergency door came open with a crash of pressurized air, and two of Lucien's men went back toward it simultaneously. And the man who had been standing post at the door was on the floor of the aisle with a wound in his shoulder that he was holding with his opposite hand and saying something through his teeth that Damon couldn't hear over the rushing sound of the open door and the cold night air flooding the cabin. Lucien was moving before Damon fully processed what was happening. Seraphine was also moving, and this was the thing that stopped Damon's heart for a single complete beat. She was not moving away from the breach, not moving toward the front of the plane, not doing any of the things that the 3 years of ghost-quiet domesticity in his penthouse would have suggested. She was moving toward it, low, fast, with the specific body mechanics of someone who has been trained to move toward threat rather than away, which meant she was not the woman he had watched pour coffee into a drain every morning, or rather she was that woman and also this one, and the distance between those two versions of her was the precise measurement of everything he had failed to understand. One of Lucien's men caught her arm. She didn't fight it. She stopped, assessed, and redirected to the man on the floor, dropping beside him and pressing her own hands over his on the wound with the efficiency of someone who has done emergency pressure application before, talking to him in a low voice that Damon couldn't hear. The breach was contained in 40 seconds. Two individuals who had come through the rear door were now on the floor of the aisle in zip restraints, and one of Lucien's men was bleeding from a cut above his eye and treating it with the resignation of someone who considered this a minor inconvenience. Lucien crouched in front of one of the restrained individuals. He spoke for 30 seconds in a voice too low for Damon to hear from 5 feet away. Then he stood up. His face was different. Damon, he said. Something in the way he said the name made Damon's stomach drop before he knew why. What? He said. Lucien looked at him. Your uncle is not in the hotel. Then where? He's at your building, Lucien said. He moved there 40 minutes ago with 6 men. He's in your server room. He paused. He's not destroying the evidence. He's copying it. A beat. All of it. Everything Seraphine accumulated. Every document, every financial trace, every piece of intelligence she built over 3 years, he's downloading it. And when he's finished, he's going to burn the originals and walk out with a clean version that he controls. Damon understood the architecture of the disaster in full. If Gideon walked out of that server room with that documentation, he didn't just eliminate the case against himself. He had a complete operational intelligence file. Seraphine's years of work, her methods, her sources, her contacts, that he could use to rebuild and extend his network. Every person she had ever worked with, every anonymous intermediary, every protected source, all of it in Gideon's hands, and all of it pointing, on paper, at a woman whose identity was currently in the process of being restored. He'll use it against her, Damon said. He'll use it against both of you, Lucien said, and against 3 people in my organization whose covers are embedded in that documentation and who will not survive being exposed. Seraphine stood up from beside the injured man. Her hands were dark with blood she didn't look at. "How long does he need?" she said. 40 minutes, Lucian said. "Maybe less." "How long to get back to Midtown from here?" 25 minutes? In good conditions?" She looked at Damon. He looked back at her. "I know the building," he said. "I know the server room. I know every secondary access point, every camera blind spot, every system override in the security infrastructure." He paused. "And Gideon knows I know them, which means he'll have planned for me coming through the front." "So you don't come through the front," she said. "There's a maintenance corridor," he said. "Sub-basement. It runs parallel to the server room's east wall. The access hatch hasn't been on the security system since a renovation 4 years ago. I flagged it. Harrington told me it was patched." He let that land. It wasn't. Lucian looked at his sister. Something passed between them. Not words, not even a look in the conventional sense. More the compressed communication of two people who have been surviving together long enough that the language is mostly abbreviated. She said, "I go with him." Lucian said, "Absolutely not." She said, "Lucian." "Sarah." His voice cracked on the word, just barely, the single hairline fracture in the controlled surface, and he sealed it immediately. "These men came through the rear door of a moving aircraft. If Gideon has 6 personnel inside that building and you walk in, I'm the only one who knows exactly what's in that server room," she said. "I built that documentation over 3 years. I know where every file sits, what every folder contains, which drives are redundant. If we go in and grab indiscriminately, we get 90% and leave the 10% that exposes your people." She held his gaze. "And you know that I am the only person in this conversation qualified to make those decisions under pressure in a room that's being actively wiped." Lucian put both hands on top of his head and looked at the ceiling. It was, Damon thought, possibly the most human thing he had seen the man do. "4 of my people go with you," Lucian said finally. "2, she said. "Any more and we lose the stealth advantage. Gideon will have the building entrance covered, small team or nothing." 3, Lucian said. "And Damon is not a combat asset." "I'm a navigation asset," Damon said. "I know the building." Lucian looked at him for a long moment. The look was the kind that takes a person apart along the seams and checks each component against some internal standard. Whatever he found, he didn't share. "You do exactly what my people tell you," he said. "The moment you become a problem, they leave you where you are and complete the objective without you." He dropped his hands from his head. "Is that clear?" "Clear," Damon said. "Sarah." Lucian turned to her. "If the room is already wiped when you get there, then we go to the backup," she said. He frowned. "What backup?" She looked at him, and for the first time in the past hour, she allowed something small and almost private to cross her face. Not quite a smile, not anything so complete, but the ghost of the expression that comes before one. "The one I didn't tell Reyes about," she said. Lucian stared at her. "Where?" he said. "Somewhere Gideon will never look," she said. "Somewhere Reyes never knew existed because I built it after I suspected there was a leak and before I confirmed it." She picked up her bag from the seat. "I'll tell you when this is over." "Sarah," "When this is over," she said again, and this time it was not the patient firmness of earlier. It was the voice of a woman who has done the calculation and determined that the only way to guarantee a backup is to ensure that even the people she trusts most cannot give its location away under pressure. Lucian looked like he wanted to argue. He didn't. 30 minutes, he said. "If I don't hear from you in 30 minutes, I'm coming in regardless." 35, she said. "The server room will take time." 30, he said. Non-negotiable. She picked up her jacket. She looked at Damon. "Can you get us to that maintenance corridor without being seen from the front entrance?" "Yes," he said. "Are you certain?" He thought about the building he had designed from the ground up. The corridors he'd walked 1,000 times. The maintenance hatch he'd flagged 4 years ago and been told was patched and never personally verified. He thought about every assumption he'd made without checking. "Yes," he said again. "This one I'm certain of." She looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she turned toward the aircraft door, and one of Lucien's men moved ahead of her, and the New York night came in cold and sharp as they descended the stairs. And behind him Damon heard Lucien's voice, low and close, meant only for him. "You bring her back," Lucian said. Not a request. Not quite a threat. Something in the register between the two. in the specific frequency of a man handing you the thing he cannot afford to lose and telling you with his whole body what happens if you drop it. Whatever else happens in that building tonight, you bring her back. Damon didn't turn around. I will, he said. He meant it in the way you mean things when you finally understand the cost of meaning nothing for a very long time. The SUV pulled away from the tarmac into the dark, and the runway lights remained off behind them, and somewhere across the city in a server room 41 floors up, a man who had spent 7 years building a trap was in the final minutes of closing it, not yet knowing that the woman he had spent those same years hunting had left him one door he didn't know existed, and that she was coming through the dark to reach it before he did. Damon gave the driver the address for the building's service entrance, not the main lobby address that appeared on every public record and every map, but the delivery access on the west side of the block that ran behind the building through a narrow service alley most of the permanent staff had forgotten existed. The driver didn't question it. He drove. Seraphine sat beside Damon in the back seat with her bag on her lap and her eyes on her phone, a secondary phone that had appeared from somewhere inside her jacket, matte black, no visible branding, the kind of device that doesn't exist in any consumer catalog. She was reading something, scrolling with the focused speed of someone who has been waiting to access this information and is now moving through it faster than most people read at all. One of Lucien's men, the one called Van Holt, was in the front passenger seat. 2 more were in the vehicle directly behind them. Nobody spoke for the first 4 minutes of the drive. Then Seraphine said, without looking up from the phone, Harrington swiped into the server room at 10:52. Damon turned to look at her. You have access to my building's security logs? I have access to your building's security logs, she confirmed, in the tone of a woman confirming she knows where the spare key is kept. He sat with that for a moment. Since when? Since 8 months after we were married, she said. There was an incident, a gap in the physical security on the 39th floor that your team didn't catch. I flagged it through a third party rather than directly because I couldn't explain how I'd identified it without explaining things I wasn't ready to explain. She paused, scrolling. They patched the physical gap. I kept the access I'd used to find it. He thought about the 39th floor incident. He remembered it vaguely. A security audit that had turned up a vulnerability, efficiently resolved, attributed to a routine external review. He had signed off on the corrective action report without asking who had commissioned the review. 3 years of his company's life and hers, and the two had been layered over each other in ways he was still only beginning to map. Harrington is still in the room, she said. He hasn't moved. Gideon's men are on 38 and 40, above and below, standard containment positioning. She finally looked up. They're being careful. They're not rushing, which means they have confidence in their timeline. They think we're still at the airport, Van Holt said from the front. They think we're still at the airport, she agreed, which gives us the only advantage we're going to get tonight, so I'd like to use it before someone on Gideon's network updates him. The SUV turned into the service alley. Damon directed the driver to the specific point, 30 meters past the loading dock, adjacent to a utility panel that looked identical to the 6 others spaced along the alley wall, and was distinguishable only by the fact that the third bolt from the top left was not a bolt at all. He got out of the car and went to the panel and pressed the third bolt and held it for 3 seconds, and the maintenance access door set into the wall beside it, unlocked with a sound so quiet that you would miss it if you were expecting something mechanical. Van Holt was beside him before the door was fully open. How long is the corridor? Van Holt said. 60 meters, Damon said. Left turn at the end, then a ladder up 12 feet, then a horizontal crawlway that exits into the building's sub-basement mechanical room. From there, it's 1 floor up by stairwell to the server room level. Cameras in the mechanical room? 1, fixed angle, covers the main equipment bank, not the access hatch. Van Holt looked at him, the flat professional assessment Damon was becoming familiar with. Then he nodded and went through the door first. The corridor was exactly as Damon remembered it. Narrow, concrete, lit by a strip of emergency lighting that threw everything into pale amber shadow. The air was cold and smelled of old water and electrical insulation. Their footsteps were quiet by instinct rather than instruction. The space had that quality of demanding silence, the low ceiling and close walls compressing sound and attention simultaneously. Seraphine was directly behind him. He could hear her breathing, steady, controlled, the measured cadence of someone managing their own physiology with intention. He found himself listening to it the way you listen to something that orients you when visibility is poor. They reached the ladder. Van Holt went up first, then Damon, then Seraphine, then the two additional men who had maintained a rear position through the corridor, moving with the specific quiet of people who have done this in much less favorable conditions and considered this manageable. The crawlway was tighter than he remembered. He was broader through the shoulders than he'd been 4 years ago, and he moved through it with his arms forward and his face close to the concrete and his mind running the floor plan of the building above him, counting distances, recalling the precise position of the server room's east wall and the distance from the sub-basement ceiling to the first floor above it. The mechanical room was loud with the sound of HVAC equipment, which was operationally useful. The ambient noise covered their movement in a way that the silent corridor had not. Van Holt located the fixed camera immediately, noted its angle, moved through the room's blind spot with the ease of someone reading a map, and signaled the others through. The stairwell was clear. They went up 1 floor. Van Holt stopped them at the stairwell door with a raised fist, pressed his ear briefly toward the door's gap, and held up 2 fingers. 2 people in the hallway. He made a small circular motion with his index finger. Not Gideon's people. Building security, standard rotation. He looked at Damon. Damon understood what was being asked. He thought about the rotation schedule. Tuesday night, this hour, the security team on this floor ran a 12-minute circuit. He looked at his watch. He held up 4 fingers. 4 minutes until the rotation moved the guards away from this section. They waited. The 4 minutes were the longest Damon had spent standing still in recent memory. I was aware of Seraphine beside him in the dark of the stairwell, aware of her stillness, which was a different quality of stillness than the corridor or the crawlway. Not the compressed quiet of someone moving carefully, but the absolute internal stillness of a person who has learned to exist completely inside the present moment, with no energy wasted on what comes before or after it. He had thought, for 3 years, that this quality in her was passivity. He understood now that it was the opposite. It was the most disciplined form of readiness he had ever seen. Van Holt touched his arm. The guards had moved. They went through the door. The server room was 20 meters down the hall, and the hallway was empty, and the door to the server room had light coming from beneath it, and from inside came the low, continuous hum of cooling systems working against the heat of active drives. Van Holt placed a small device against the door's electronic lock. 12 seconds. The light on the lock went from red to green without any sound at all. He opened the door. Marcus Harrington was standing at the primary terminal bank with a drive array connected to the main interface port and a laptop open beside him, and he turned around when the door opened with the expression of a man who had calculated the variables and was confident none of them included this. For exactly 1 second, he was simply a man who had been wrong about something. Then he moved toward a secondary panel on the far wall, and Van Holt was across the room before Damon had processed the movement, and Harrington's arm was immobilized against his body at an angle that stopped the motion completely. "Don't," Van Holt said. That was all. Harrington didn't. Seraphine walked past both of them to the primary terminal. She looked at the drive array. She looked at the laptop screen. Her expression didn't change in any way that Damon could categorize. It was not shock, not anger, not relief. It was assessment, the face of a person reading a technical situation and determining the correct response before committing to any emotional register. "He's 40% through the copy," she said. "The encryption layer is still intact on the primary files." She sat down at the terminal without being invited to and began typing with the speed and precision of someone who knows exactly which keys need to be pressed and in what sequence. "I can interrupt the transfer and restore the directory to the secure partition in about 6 minutes. "Do it," Damon said. She was already doing it. He turned to Harrington. Harrington was 53 years old, a trim, gray-haired man with the kind of face that conveyed institutional reliability. The face of a man whose colleagues described him as steady and whose family thought of him as a little boring, and who had, for 6 years, sat across a conference table from Damon Cross and asked the questions of a man performing the exercise of not knowing things he already knew. "How long?" Damon said. Harrington said nothing. "How long has Gideon had you?" Damon said. Still nothing. The nothing of a man calculating whether cooperation had anything left to offer him. "Your transfer is being reversed," Damon said. Whatever you are taking out of this room is not going to Gideon. Whatever Gideon promised you in exchange for 6 years of access to my company's financial infrastructure is not going to arrive." He kept his voice level. I was not angry. He was past anger, in the specific country on the other side of it where things are simply true and the only question is what to do with the truth. So the calculation you're running right now, the one where you decide whether telling me anything is worth more to you than not telling me, I'd encourage you to run it again with the current information. Harrington looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes. Not remorse, not exactly, but the specific exhaustion of a man who has been holding something at arm's length for a long time and whose arms have finally given out. 8 years, he said. He had me before you hired me. I was already his when he recommended me to you. Damon absorbed that. The anonymous investments, he said. You knew. I knew they were coming from Lucian Draven's network, Harrington said. I didn't know it was her specifically until about 14 months ago. He glanced towards Seraphine at the terminal. When I figured it out, I told Gideon. He told me to let it continue. A pause. He said she was making herself useful. The phrase landed like something thrown. At the terminal, Seraphine's typing did not pause, but the set of her shoulders changed just slightly. The almost imperceptible shift of a person absorbing a sentence they will carry for a long time and have to decide at some later date what to do with. Damon looked at Harrington and felt something he didn't have a clean name for. Not quite rage, too cold for rage, too purposeful. The specific focused anger of a man who has finally understood the complete shape of something and is deciding exactly where to apply pressure. Where is Gideon now? He said. I don't know, Harrington said. I don't get his location. I get instructions. Who gives them? Harrington said a name. Van Holt, still holding his arm at the angle that discouraged motion, memorized it without writing it down. From the terminal, Seraphine said, Done. She pulled the drive array free of the interface port and held it up briefly before placing it in her bag. Transfer reversed. Primary files re-encrypted and partitioned. His copy is corrupted beyond recovery. She stood. And I've just sent a clean set of backups to 3 separate external locations, so whatever happens to this room in the next hour is no longer relevant. She said it to the room generally, but the last sentence was directed at Harrington, and its meaning was precise. Whatever Gideon was planning to do to this server room after the transfer completed, it was now pointless. Harrington closed his eyes. He's gonna know, he said. In about 10 minutes, when the transfer signal drops, he's going to know something went wrong. Yes, Seraphine said. And he's going to know you're here, Harrington said. In this building, right now. Yes, she said again. She looked at Damon. The look contained information he was still learning to read. She had the specific expression of someone who has completed the objective she came for and is now making a calculation about the next 60 seconds that she has not yet shared with the room. Then Van Holt's radio emitted a single burst of static, and from somewhere above them, not from this floor, from higher, from the stairwell they had come up through or the one adjacent to it, came the sound of a door opening with force. And Seraphine said very quietly, to no one in particular, He wasn't waiting for the transfer to finish. She turned to Van Holt. He was waiting for us to get here. The lights in the server room went out. The darkness in the server room lasted 4 seconds. Then the emergency lighting kicked in, red, low, the color of something wrong. And in that red light, Damon could see Van Holt already moving, already pushing Harrington toward the floor with one hand and drawing with the other, and the 2 men who had come through the corridor with them taking positions on either side of the door with the automatic efficiency of people for whom this specific transition from stillness to action has been rehearsed until it requires no thought at all. Seraphine was at his side. He didn't see her move. She was simply there, her hand on his arm, not gripping, just present. And she said into his ear, East wall, behind the secondary rack, now. He moved. She moved with him. They went low and fast to the far corner of the room, behind a floor-to-ceiling rack of servers that threw a shadow deep enough to be useful, and he pressed his back against the wall and felt the cold of it through his shirt and listened. The footsteps in the stairwell were not trying to be quiet. That was the thing that told him the shape of what was coming. Professionals who stop being quiet when they've decided that speed matters more than surprise, which means they already know the surprise is gone, which means Gideon had been watching the building and had seen something, or someone had told him something in the last 4 minutes. He looked at Seraphine in the red light. Her face was close to his. Her eyes were completely clear. "How many?" he said. "Gideon came with 6, she said. 2 are on 38, 2 on 40. That leaves 2 for this floor, plus however many he called in when the transfer signal dropped." She paused. "He'll have called in more." "How much more?" "Gideon doesn't do things by half," she said. "Double what he started with, minimum." Van Holt's voice came from across the room, low and controlled. "Door's wired. They put a charge on it from the outside while we were in here. Can't open it outward without triggering it." A pause. "Alternative exit." "There isn't one," Damon said. "This room has one door." A silence in which everyone in the room absorbed this information and reached the same conclusion through different routes. "The east wall," Seraphine said. She was looking at the wall behind them, at the rack, at the wall beyond it, at something Damon couldn't see. "This is a retrofit floor. The server room was expanded 8 years ago. The original east wall is the exterior building wall, but the expansion pushed through into what used to be a document storage room. The original wall is still there. It's just behind the drywall that was put up during the renovation." Damon turned and looked at the wall. Standard drywall, painted gray, completely unremarkable. He thought back to the renovation permits, the architectural drawings, the contractor reports. He had signed off on all of them. He had not read the wall specifications. "How thick?" Van Holt said. 5/8-inch drywall over the original plaster, she said. "Maybe 3 inches total to get through to the storage room." "And the storage room?" "Has a door to the main hallway on the 41st floor's north corridor," she said, "which is the one corridor Gideon won't have covered because it dead ends at a fire exit that opens onto the exterior staircase." Van Holt looked at one of his men, who was already removing something from his jacket. A compact breaching tool, flat and brutal looking, the kind that suggests its user has needed it before in spaces tighter than this. 40 seconds, Van Holt said. "They'll hear it," Damon said. "They'll hear it regardless," Van Holt said. "We either make noise and go, or we stay quiet and stay here." Outside the server room door, a voice said something in a language Damon didn't recognize. Then it said, in English, close enough to the door that the proximity was the threat, "Mr. Cross, we have no interest in complicating this more than it needs to be. Open the door, step out, and we can resolve this quickly." Nobody in the room moved. The voice was patient, practiced. The voice of a man who uses this exact sentence with regularity. "You have 30 seconds, the voice said, "before we resolve it differently." Van Holt's man hit the wall. The first impact of the breaching tool against the drywall was loud, in the way that makes the body react before the mind does. Damon felt his shoulders come up, felt his pulse jump, felt the specific animal response to a sudden hard sound in an enclosed space. The second impact was louder. The third broke through, and the fourth opened a gap wide enough to see the darkness of the original storage room beyond. And by the fifth, the gap was large enough for a person to move through if they moved without hesitation. Outside the door, the patience in the voice had evaporated. "Breach it," the man said to someone else, and the sound of something being attached to the exterior of the door had a finality to it that translated across the wall without needing to be seen. "Go," Van Holt said. "Go now." The man with the breaching tool went through first, fast and low. The second man went. Van Holt looked at Harrington, who was on the floor against the far wall with his hands zip-tied in front of him, and the expression of a man who had made a sequence of decisions that had resulted in him being on the floor of a server room with his hands tied while people went through walls around him. "Get up," Van Holt said. Harrington got up. Damon looked at Seraphine. She was already at the gap in the wall. She looked back at him with the red emergency lighting on half her face and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wasn't implicit in the situation. And then she went through. He went through after her. The storage room beyond was dark and close and smelled of old paper and disuse, and the floor was clear enough to move across quickly, and the door to the north corridor was exactly where Seraphine had said it was. Van Holt came through last with Harrington, and the sound from the server room behind them shifted from a building charge of preparation to a sharp, contained detonation as the door they'd just left came off its frame. They ran. The north corridor was narrow and unlit beyond the emergency strip at floor level, and they ran it in single file with Seraphine second and Damon behind her, and the sound of their footsteps swallowed by the sound of shouting from the server room that was growing and reorganizing in the way sound reorganizes when the people making it realize the room they've just forced their way into is empty. The fire exit at the end of the corridor hit cold night air and a metal exterior staircase that clung to the building's north face in the specific utilitarian way of structures designed for evacuation rather than use. They poured through it, all 5 of them, plus Harrington, and the door swung shut behind them, and the night was loud with the city that had no idea what was happening 41 floors above its streets. "Down," Van Holt said. They went down. 12 floors down, Van Holt stopped them on a landing. "They'll have the ground-level exits covered," he said. He was breathing hard, not from exertion, from the compound physiological effect of sustained operational stress, the specific kind of breathing that happens when adrenaline has been running for long enough that the body is trying to renegotiate. "We need extraction before we reach street level." He raised Lucien on his radio. The response was immediate. Lucien's voice was clipped and completely level in the way that suggested he was managing something on his end that also required leveling. "What's your position?" "Exterior north staircase, 41-12, Van Holt said. "We have the package. We have an additional passenger." He glanced at Harrington. "And Gideon's people are in the building." "How many?" "Unknown. More than we started with." A pause of exactly 2 seconds. "There's a loading dock on the north side, street level, set back from the main entrance by about 30 meters. My people can be there in 4 minutes. Can you hold position?" Van Holt looked at the staircase above them. From somewhere up there, a door had just opened. "Negative on holding," he said. 3 minutes, Lucien said. "We'll be at the dock in 3, Van Holt said, and clicked off, and looked at the group on the landing. "We move straight down, no stops. Loading dock north side. If any door on the way opens, you don't stop to look at it." They moved. The problem materialized on the 22nd floor landing. Not from above, from below. A door on the landing opened inward, and 2 men came through it, and the half-second of mutual recognition that followed was the entire gap between one outcome and another. Van Holt was already moving through that gap before it closed, and what happened on the landing was fast and violent and not clean. And when it was over, both men were down and Van Holt was bleeding from a cut along his forearm that he looked at once with the expression of a man noting something for later management, and they kept moving. Damon's chest was burning. Not from the stairs, from the sustained compound effect of the last 40 minutes, the adrenaline and the fear, and the thing that lived underneath both of them. The specific dread of a man who is beginning to understand that the distance between where he is and where Gideon Cross is prepared to go is much shorter than he had calculated. Seraphine was in front of him. She had not stumbled. She had not made a sound on the landing when the 2 men came through the door. She had moved to the side with the immediate spatial awareness of someone who has been trained to clear the operational area for the people doing the work. And she had done it without instruction, and he had watched it happen from behind with the disorienting sensation of seeing someone he had known in one dimension reveal all the others simultaneously. Ground floor. Loading dock door. They hit it at speed. The dock was recessed and dark and cold, and the smell of the alley was diesel and wet concrete, and the specific mineral smell of the city at night, and a black SUV was already rolling toward them with its lights off, moving with the controlled urgency of a vehicle being driven by someone who knows how to move fast without announcing it. They loaded in 12 seconds. The door closed. They moved. In the SUV, Van Holt's man was working on his arm with a field kit from somewhere under the seat. Harrington was between 2 of Lucien's men in the back row with the compressed posture of a man who has run out of calculations. Seraphine was in the middle seat beside Damon, and for the first moment since the server room went dark, she let out a breath that was longer than her previous ones. Not quite a sigh, not quite relief, but the body's acknowledgement that one phase of something had ended and another was about to begin. Her hands, he noticed, were shaking. Slightly. The kind of shake that comes after, not during, when the body finally permits itself to register what it has been through. She noticed him noticing. She put her hands flat on her thighs and pressed. "It's normal," she said to no one in particular. "I know," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You're doing it too." He looked down. His right hand, where it rested on his knee, had a tremor in it that he hadn't been aware of until she pointed it out. He pressed it flat against his leg. "The files are secure?" he said. Because he needed to say something that was about the objective, about the next thing, not about his hands or her hands, or the distance between them in the back seat of a car moving through the dark. The copies are distributed to 3 external servers, she said. Each one is encrypted independently. Gideon can burn the original server room to concrete, and it won't change what we can present. She paused. Harrington's testimony, plus the documentation, plus the financial traces I've been building, it's enough. It's more than enough. For prosecution? For multiple prosecutions, she said, federal level, possibly international, depending on which jurisdictions Gideon's network touches, which is several. He looked at Harrington's profile in the dim light of the moving vehicle. He'll cooperate, he said. It wasn't a question. He already doesn't have a choice, she said. He knows that. Harrington said nothing. He was looking at the back of the headrest in front of him with the specific nowhere gaze of a man who has accepted the complete collapse of a structure he spent years building and is now simply waiting for the debris to settle. The SUV pulled off the main road onto a service route that Damon didn't recognize, and then into an underground parking structure, and when it stopped and the doors opened, Lucien was already there. He was standing between 2 of his vehicles with his jacket open and his headset around his neck and his eyes, going immediately and without apology to Seraphine, running the rapid full-body assessment of a man who needed to confirm a thing before he could do anything else. She stepped out of the SUV and said, "I'm fine." "You're shaking," he said. "I was shaking," she said. "I'm done now." She said it with enough finality that he let it go, which told Damon something about the particular negotiation that existed between them. Not that she was fragile and he was protective, but that she had clear and enforced limits on how much of her experience she permitted anyone, including her brother, to manage. Lucien looked at Damon. "Files?" he said. "Distributed and secured," Damon said. 3 external locations. Seraphine has the access credentials." Lucien nodded. Then he looked at Harrington, and whatever was in the look made Harrington straighten involuntarily, the instinct of a smaller animal identifying something it needs to position itself correctly in front of. "Put him in the second vehicle," Lucien said to Van Holt. "He talks to nobody until our legal team is on the phone." Van Holt moved Harrington without ceremony. Lucien pulled Damon aside. Not far, 3 steps, just out of immediate earshot of the group. "Gideon left the building," he said, 20 minutes ago before you got out. My surveillance had him going north." He paused. "He knows the transfer failed. He knows you're mobile. He's not in a reactive position anymore. He's in a contingency." He looked at Damon with the level, evaluative gaze that Damon was becoming accustomed to. "Which means he goes to his insurance." "What insurance?" Damon said. "The thing that he believes makes him untouchable," Lucien said. "The reason he let your company run for 7 years without taking it. The reason he let Seraphine protect it, and you without intervening." He paused. "He has a partner. Someone inside the federal system. Not a contact, not an asset, an actual embedded partner. Someone with the authority to bury a case or redirect an investigation before it reaches a prosecutor's desk." Damon stared at him. "You knew about this?" "I suspected it," Lucien said. "I've had 3 investigations into Gideon's network that died at the intake level over the past 4 years. That doesn't happen by chance, and it doesn't happen with money alone. It happens when someone has a hand on the mechanism itself." He looked at the floor briefly. "I don't have a name. That's the gap in everything Seraphine built. The documentation is complete on Gideon's financial operation and his network connections, but the federal partner, that's the piece that's missing. If he reaches that person before we do," Damon started, "then the documentation becomes inadmissible on a procedural technicality manufactured by someone who knows exactly which procedure to target," Lucien said. "And Gideon walks. Not immediately. It takes time to collapse a case from inside. But he walks." Damon thought for a moment. He thought about Gideon at every boardroom meeting, at every family dinner. The specific quality of his uncle's attention, always interested, always present, always asking the right questions. The performance of a man who had decided, long ago, that the safest place to operate was in the blind spot of someone who trusted him completely. "Harmon," Damon said. Lucien looked at him. "Seraphine told me to call an FBI contact. Harmon direct line, not the main office. She said he'd know what it meant." He looked at Lucien. "She told me before she even knew the extent of what Gideon had. Before the server room, before Reyes, before any of tonight. She had a name ready. Something shifted in Lucien's expression. He turned towards Seraphine, who was 20 feet away talking to Van Holt in the low, efficient way she had, and he said her name. She looked over. Harmon, he said. She crossed to them. She looked between the two of them and said, He's clean. I've been verifying him for 8 months. He's the one who flagged the intake failures to an outside contact because he knew something was blocking them internally. He doesn't have a name either, but he has enough to open a protected channel that the embedded partner can't reach. How long to reach him? Lucian said. I have his emergency contact protocol, she said. 20 minutes to establish the channel, but it has to be from a verified identity, which means I need to use my real name, she paused. My actual name, not Vale, not the name I've been using. The silence that followed was specific. Damon understood its shape before he understood its content. It was the silence of a threshold, the kind that separates what came before from what comes after, in a way that can't be walked back. Once I use that name, she said, in a federal communication channel, on record, the identity Lucian built for me is gone. 12 years of protective cover ended. Lucian looked at his sister for a long moment. It was always going to end, he said. His voice was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with operational caution. I built it to keep you alive, not to keep you small. She held his gaze. I know, she said. Then make the call, he said. She nodded once. She reached into her bag for the secondary phone, and then she stopped. Because from the entry ramp of the parking structure, headlights appeared, not Lucian's vehicles. The angle was wrong, the approach was wrong, and the vehicle that came down the ramp was a single black sedan moving at the specific controlled speed of something that doesn't intend to be stopped. Every one of Lucian's people in the structure shifted simultaneously, the synchronized attention of trained personnel identifying a new variable. The sedan stopped 30 feet from where they were standing. The driver's door opened. Gideon Cross stepped out. I was 61 years old, slim, silver-haired, dressed in the kind of suit that costs more than most people's monthly income, and wears it with the ease of a man who has never needed to think about what he was wearing, because what he was wearing had always simply been correct. He looked exactly as he looked at every boardroom meeting, at every family dinner, in every context where Damon had watched him and seen steadiness and experience and the particular authority of a man who had been in rooms like this for decades. He was alone. Or appeared to be. He looked at Damon first, not at Lucienne, not at Seraphine. At Damon, and the look was the look of a man acknowledging something he had not expected to have to acknowledge. Not quite respect, not quite regret, but something in the narrow space between the two. I raised you, Gideon said. His voice was exactly as Damon remembered it, unhurried, faintly paternal. The voice of a man who had always occupied the position of most reliable person in any room. After your parents, I was there for every significant thing in your life. I built your company alongside you, and you chose, he gestured a minimal movement toward Lucian, toward Seraphine. This. You tried to have her killed, Damon said. I tried to resolve a problem, Gideon said, that has been compounding for 12 years. You were a casualty of geography. You happened to be in the way. That was never personal, Damon. She was my wife, Damon said. She was a liability, Gideon said, without any particular heat. And you never once treated her as anything else, so let's not perform outrage about it now. The sentence hit precisely because it was true in the way that the worst things are true. Not entirely, not fairly, but enough that it couldn't be simply deflected. Seraphine said from beside him, You knew who I was before the marriage. Gideon looked at her. Yes. You let Lucien arrange it. I encouraged it, he said. Having you inside a household I had access to was considerably more convenient than hunting you across 3 continents. You were remarkably difficult to locate for the first 7 years. Something that might have been professional appreciation crossed his face. Your brother does competent work. Lucian said nothing. His stillness was the specific stillness of a man who is deciding the precise moment and method of something. What do you want? Seraphine said. I want the files, Gideon said. The copies you distributed tonight. All access credentials, all redundancies, all of it. In exchange, he paused, I walk away. From the company. From you. From all of it. I have enough to build elsewhere, and frankly, this particular operation has become more expensive than its returns justify. You're serious, Damon said. I'm always serious, Gideon said. This is a transaction. It's always been a transaction. You just didn't know you were in it. Seraphine looked at Damon, then at Lucian. Lucian reached into his jacket. Gideon raised one hand, a gesture of pause, unhurried, the gesture of a man who believes he still controls the pace of this, and said, Before you do whatever you're about to do, you should know that I have 7 men on the structure's upper level with clear sightlines to this floor. If I don't make a call in the next 3 minutes, they come down. He lowered his hand. So let's have the conversation first. He looked at Seraphine. The files, he said. And we're done. She looked back at him. In the pale light of the parking structure, with everything that had happened in the past 4 hours still written in the set of her jaw and the steadiness of her eyes, she looked at the man who had spent 12 years trying to end her life, and she said the one thing he hadn't budgeted for in any version of the conversation he had prepared. No, she said. The words sat in the structure's cold air with a simplicity that made it more forceful than any sentence that could have surrounded it. Gideon's expression didn't change, but his hand moved toward his pocket, and Damon moved without thinking. Not toward Gideon, not in the operational direction, but sideways, between Seraphine and the angle of Gideon's movement, and the instinct of it surprised him as much as it surprised anyone. The sudden body knowledge that this was the thing he was doing, this was the position he was taking, not because it was tactical or smart or anything approaching the decisions a man with his background makes, but because 3 years of standing at windows while she poured coffee down drains had to eventually add up to something, and this was what it added up to. Gideon looked at him standing there. Something moved across the older man's face. Not the thing Damon had expected, not calculation or adjustment, but something older and stranger than that. Something that in another man might have been grief, and was in Gideon simply the flat recognition of a variable that had finally, after decades of reliable behavior, done something genuinely unpredictable. Damon, he said. You're done, Damon said. Above them, on the parking structure's upper level, something changed. Not Gideon's men, something else. A sound that didn't belong to the architecture, that came from multiple directions simultaneously and carried the specific character of a coordinated entry that had been waiting for a signal. Lucian's phone buzzed once. He looked at it. The expression on his face changed in the specific way of someone receiving confirmation of something they hoped for but didn't count on. He looked at Gideon. Harmon sends his regards, Lucian said. And every light in the parking structure came on at once. The lights came on and stayed on. From the upper level of the parking structure, the sound of coordinated entry resolved into something visible. Federal agents in tactical gear coming down both ramp access points simultaneously, moving with the specific organized weight of people who have been waiting in position for long enough to be very ready. 12 of them, then more, fanning into the structure's lower level, with weapons drawn and identification visible, and voices that cut through the cold air with the clipped authority of people who had paperwork for everything they were about to do. Gideon Cross stood in the center of the structure's floor and watched them come. He didn't run. Damon had half expected him to make some motion toward the sedan, toward the ramp, toward any of the exits that were now sealed by bodies and vehicles, and the implacable momentum of a federal operation that had clearly been waiting for exactly this location and exactly this moment. But Gideon didn't run. He stood with his hands at his sides, and his face composed in the expression he had worn at every boardroom meeting and every family dinner, the expression of a man who considered himself the most prepared person in any given room, and he watched the agents come, and something shifted in his eyes. Not fear, not quite, but the first intimation of it, the dawning of a man who has run the calculation and found, for the first time in a very long time, that the numbers don't resolve in his favor. An agent reached him, said the words. Gideon's hands went behind his back. He turned his head and looked at Damon once more. The look was long and contained something that Damon could not decode and did not particularly want to. The compressed communication of a man who has too much to say and has decided that saying none of it is the only remaining form of dignity available to him. Then an agent's hand on his shoulder turned him away, and Gideon Cross walked toward the ramp between 2 federal agents with his silver hair bright under the parking structure's fluorescence. And Damon watched him go and felt nothing that he had expected to feel, and everything that he hadn't. A weariness so deep it was almost structural, the specific exhaustion of a man whose entire framework for the past has just been rebuilt around a different load-bearing wall. Lucian was on his phone. He had been on his phone since the lights came on, moving slightly apart from the group with the headset back in place, managing whatever was happening on levels of this situation that Damon wasn't cleared for and probably never would be. His people were interfacing with the federal agents with the particular professional courtesy of two sets of specialists who respect each other's operational authority and have a lot to work through. Seraphine was standing where she had been standing when Damon stepped in front of her. She was looking at the ramp where Gideon had gone. Damon came to stand beside her, not close enough to require acknowledgement, close enough to be present. He really believed he'd walk out of here with the files, she said. He's believed a lot of things for a long time, Damon said. Most of them turned out to be true. Not the last one, she said. No, he said, not the last one. She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the parking structure was organized and active and populated with people who had specific jobs to do in the next several hours, which meant that the two of them existed briefly in a pocket of relative stillness at the center of it. Damon was aware of how strange it was to be standing beside her in a parking structure in the middle of the night after everything that had preceded this moment, and to have nothing to do except stand there and be honest about it. The federal partner, he said. Harmon found him? Found him 2 weeks ago, she said. I gave Lucien enough to point Harmon toward the intake failure pattern. Harmon ran it from his end. The partner is a deputy section chief named Wells. He's been Gideon's insurance for 9 years. She paused. He was taken into custody about 35 minutes ago. Different location. Harmon moved simultaneously on both of them once the channel was established. That's what Lucien was waiting for, Damon said, in the structure. He needed Wells off the board before he moved on Gideon. Yes, she said. Otherwise, Gideon gets taken in and Wells buries the case before morning. She looked at the ramp. Timing was the whole problem. It's been the whole problem for 8 months. You can't take Gideon without taking Wells first. You can't take Wells without the documentation. You couldn't get the documentation out cleanly while Reyes was feeding information. She let out a slow breath. Tonight forced it. The airport forced it. Gideon moved his timeline up because he thought he had us contained, and moving his timeline up meant moving before all his contingencies were in place. She looked at her hands. We were lucky. You were prepared, he said. Both, she said. You need both. He looked at her profile in the parking structure's white light, the line of her jaw, the specific quality of her tiredness, which was not the kind that comes from one bad night, but the kind that accumulates over years and is now, possibly, beginning to find a surface to rest on. The backup, he said. The one you didn't tell Reyes about. The one you didn't tell Lucien. She glanced at him. Where was it? He said. She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone deciding how much of a thing to give. Then she said, Your building's legal archive, 43rd floor, a subfolder in the contract management system, filed under a vendor name that doesn't exist. She paused. I had access to the system because I managed 3 contract renewals in your absence in the 2nd year of our marriage. You never asked who handled them. He absorbed that. I never asked, he said. No, she said. You didn't. It was not an accusation. It was the same plain geography as before, the statement of a distance between 2 points, measured without malice. He had spent 3 years not asking, and she had spent 3 years existing in the space that not asking creates, and here they were on the other side of it. Seraphine, he said. She waited. I know this isn't... I know the timing is wrong and the location is wrong and that I'm about 3 years late to most of what I should be saying. He stopped, tried again. I don't know how to do this correctly. I've never known how to do this correctly, which is most of the problem, but I need you to know that I understand what I did, not what was done to you. What I did. The choices I made every day that were just the choice to not look, to not ask, to be in the same space as you and treat that as sufficient. He looked at his hands. It wasn't sufficient. It was the opposite of sufficient. And I can't fix what it cost you. And I'm not asking you to. I'm not asking you for anything. I just need to have said it. She listened. She didn't move and she didn't fill the silence after he finished. And he appreciated that she didn't, because the silence was the correct response to a thing that didn't require resolution or comfort, just acknowledgement. Then she said, "I know." 2 words, carrying more weight than most speeches. "I know you understand," she said. "That's the thing about you, Damon. You understand things. You're one of the most perceptive people I've been around. You see structures, patterns, implications. You read a room in 20 seconds that other people need 20 minutes for." She turned to look at him. "You just never pointed that perception at me. Not once in 3 years. And I kept thinking, one day he'll turn it this direction and see what's here. And you never did." She looked away again. "That's not something I can give you retroactive credit for understanding now." "I know," he said. "But," she said, and the word had a weight to it that made him go still, "I don't think you're the same man you were this morning. I think something happened between 9:47 and right now that changed the internal architecture somewhat." She said it with the deliberate precision of a woman who doesn't want to overpromise, but also doesn't want to deny something true. "I'm not sure what to do with that yet." "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "No," she said. "I don't." She almost smiled. Not quite, but the intention of one moved across her face like weather. That's new, actually, not having to do anything with it. Not having to manage it, or redirect it, or quietly absorb it, and carry it somewhere Lucian won't see. She looked at the structure around them. This is the first time in 12 years that the threat is actually contained. Not managed, not deferred, not monitored. Contained. She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what I feel about that yet either." "You have time to figure it out," he said. "Yes," she said. "I think I do." Across the structure, Lucian ended his call. He stood for a moment with his phone in his hand, not looking at anything, the specific posture of a man taking 30 seconds to be somewhere private before returning to the room. Then he crossed to them. He looked at Seraphine the way he'd been looking at her since the airport. The look that had Damon recalibrated every assumption about protectiveness. Because it wasn't the protective surveillance of a man who believed someone was fragile. It was the look of a man who has spent 12 years carrying the weight of a decision he made and has finally, tonight, been permitted to put it down. "Wells is in custody," he said. "The case is going to the main federal docket by morning. Harmon's moving it himself." He looked at her. "It's over." She held his gaze. "Reyes?" she said. Something moved through Lucien's face. "He's alive. Gideon's people had him. He's in a hospital in Queens with 2 broken ribs and a story that's going to take several hours to tell." He paused. "He says he was coerced, that they had his daughter." Seraphine closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. "Do they?" she said. "We don't know yet," Lucian said. "We're looking." He said it in the way that meant every resource he had was looking and had been since the moment they found the blood in the hotel room. "Whatever the truth is, we'll know it before we decide what it means." She nodded. The nod of a woman who has learned at great cost that things require their full information before they can be judged, and that the impulse to judge quickly is almost always a form of self-protection rather than fairness. "The organization?" she said. Lucian was quiet for a moment. "That's a longer conversation." "I know," she said. But, he said. He looked at the ramp where Gideon had gone, which was now just a concrete incline in a parking structure, neutral and unremarkable. "I've been thinking about it for a long time. What it is and what I want it to be, and whether those 2 things can be made to overlap." He looked back at her. "Reyes was the 4th person in 9 years who was turned against us. The 4th. That's not bad luck. That's a structural problem. When you build something on fear, you also build in the mechanisms of your own undoing, because people who operate under fear look for the first viable alternative that presents itself." He paused. "I'm tired of patching it." "Then stop patching it," she said. He looked at her. "You've been building an intelligence network for 12 years, she said. "You already know how to gather information, protect sources, run operations across jurisdictions. The only thing that changes is what you do with it." She held his gaze. "There are people who need finding, Lucian, not people who need killing, people who have been taken and nobody with your resources is looking." She paused. "You know this." "It's not a clean transition," he said. "It's not supposed to be clean," she said. "Clean transitions are for people who haven't done anything that requires undoing." He looked at her for a long time. His face, in this moment, was not the face he had presented in the terminal, or the aircraft, or the parking structure. Not the composed, controlled face of the most feared man in 3 continents. It was older than that, and more tired, and more honest. And Damon understood, watching him, that this was the face Seraphine had always known, the one that had read her fairy tales, the one that had built an entire architecture of protection around a 19-year-old girl who nearly died on a street in a city she'd been trying to leave. "Okay," Lucian said. Just that. Just okay. She reached out and put her hand on his arm, and he put his hand over hers, and the gesture lasted about 4 seconds before operational necessity dissolved it, and they were both back in the structure's fluorescent present. Harrington's cooperation was formalized over the following 6 hours in a federal building in Lower Manhattan, in a room with bad coffee and a court reporter and 2 of Harmon's people who had been awake longer than anyone should be and who were running entirely on the specific compressed energy of people who know they are building a case that will matter. Damon was present for parts of it, absent for others. He gave his own statement, 3 hours of it, everything he knew about Gideon's access to Cross Financial, every transaction he could identify in retrospect as irregular, every decision point where Gideon's guidance had shaped an outcome that now looked different in the new light. It was the most uncomfortable 3 hours of his professional life. Not because the people across the table were hostile, they weren't, but because telling the truth about how comprehensively he had been managed required him to also tell the truth about how available he had made himself to that management. The assumptions he had never checked, the questions he had never asked, the years he had spent running an empire that had a traitor at its foundation and a ghost holding it together and had not noticed either. He told the truth, all of it. The investigator across from him, a woman of about 45 with the specific patience of someone who has heard many explanations and learned to wait for the one that's real, looked at him after he'd finished and said, "Mr. Cross, in your estimation, without the financial interventions made by the person we've identified as Seraphine Draven, would the company have survived the past 3 years?" He thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. "No," he said, "it wouldn't have survived the 2nd year." She made a note. "And you were unaware of these interventions while they were occurring?" "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "How do you account for that?" He looked back at her. "I wasn't paying attention to the right things," he said. She wrote that down too. The weeks that followed had a different texture than anything that had preceded them. Gideon Cross was formally charged on 14 counts across 3 separate federal jurisdictions. The charges included financial conspiracy, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and 4 counts related to the coordination of violence against a civilian, the specific charges associated with the assassination attempts that now had a documented chain of command traced directly to his instructions. The partner, Wells, was charged separately. His name appeared in news coverage that Damon read on his phone in a hotel room. He had moved out of the penthouse the morning after the parking structure, not because anyone had asked him to, but because staying in a space that had been simultaneously his home and Seraphine's sentence for 3 years seemed like the wrong way to begin whatever was beginning. The hotel was fine, functional, anonymous. He worked from it for 5 weeks while the company's board convened emergency sessions and lawyers filed and countered, and the business press ran speculative coverage that was, in his estimation, about 60% accurate and 40% invented. He resigned as CEO on a Thursday morning in a statement that was brief and that his communications team had offered to expand and he had declined to expand. He cited the need for leadership that wasn't entangled in an ongoing federal investigation. He cited the 4,000 employees whose stability mattered more than his tenure. He did not cite Seraphine. He did not cite Gideon. He kept it clean because the people who needed to understand it would understand it without decoration. The board accepted his resignation with the specific relief of an institution that had been waiting for permission to move on. He felt lighter than he had expected. He felt specifically like a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally identified it correctly. Not as a burden, not as a weight, but as the accumulated mass of choices made in the wrong direction, and that putting it down was not defeat, but the first honest act of a recalibration that was long overdue. He started working through the financial records from the beginning. Not for the company. The company had new leadership, and they were capable, and he had given them everything they needed, for himself. He worked through everything he had been handed, inherited, built, and he tried to understand with clear eyes what had been genuinely his and what had been supported, protected, or enabled by the woman who had lived in his peripheral vision for 3 years. The number was significant. He put it in a document and sent it to her attorney with a note that said only, "This is yours." It should have been acknowledged a long time ago. "I'd like to find a way to make it formal, if you're willing." The attorney replied within 48 hours. She was willing. The meeting was arranged for a Wednesday afternoon, 6 weeks after the parking structure, in a neutral location, a conference room in a law firm in Midtown that had no connection to Cross Financial or to Lucian's operations or to any of the preceding geography. Clean ground. The kind of place where things can begin without the weight of other things. He arrived 8 minutes early. She arrived exactly on time. She looked different in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. Not changed, not in the way that dramatic events change people in stories, but more like herself, more clearly and solidly present in the way that people become when something they've been bracing against has finally resolved. She was wearing the kind of clothes that said she had dressed for herself, not for a context, and her hair was down in a way it never had been in the penthouse, and she looked at him when she came through the conference room door with the direct, unguarded attention of someone who had decided, in advance of this moment, to simply be in it without management. "You look better," she said. "Than what?" he said. "Than the last several times I've seen you," she said, which is a low bar given the circumstances. He almost smiled. She sat down across from him. The attorneys were in the room, hers and the one he'd engaged for this specifically. And there were documents on the table that would take the next hour to work through, and there was significant practical territory to cover, and he was aware that this was not a romantic scene and was not supposed to be. He covered the practical territory carefully and completely. He had prepared thoroughly, which was the thing he was capable of doing, the competence he could actually offer. He explained the financial structure he was proposing. He answered her attorney's questions. He did not try to make the conversation anything other than what it was. At the end of it, when the documents were signed and the attorneys were packing their materials, Seraphine looked at him across the table and said, "You didn't have to do it this way." "I know," he said. "You could have done it as a settlement, through the divorce proceedings, less," she searched for the word, "deliberate." "I didn't want it to be a settlement," he said. "A settlement is what you get when you negotiate someone down from a position. This is a reckoning." He held her gaze. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "There is." The attorneys left. They sat alone in the conference room for a moment that wasn't quite planned. "Lucien started the transition," she said. "It's slow. It won't be fast. Some people are leaving because they don't want what the organization is becoming. Some people are staying for the same reason." She looked at the table. "He found the girl, Reyes's daughter. She was in Barcelona. She's fine. She's been brought back. Reyes is—" She stopped. "That situation is complicated. We're still working through it." "And you?" he said. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm using my name again," she said. "My actual name. It's strange. I've been Seraphine Vale for 12 years. Being Seraphine Draven again feels like wearing clothes that fit better, but that you have to relearn how to move in." She looked at her hands. "I'm starting to remember how." "Are you staying in New York?" he said. "For now," she said. "There's work to do here. The case against Gideon needs oversight, and Lucien's operation needs someone who understands the legal and financial architecture of what he's dismantling." She paused. "That turns out to be specifically my skill set." "It does," he said. A silence that was not uncomfortable. "I'm going to build something smaller," he said. "Not another empire. Something with fewer floors and better visibility." He said it almost carefully, testing the sentence in the air. "I have some ideas about where the gaps are in the city's financial infrastructure, places where legitimate capital doesn't go because the structures aren't there to support it." He paused. "I think someone with the right background could build those structures." She looked at him. "Is this you asking for a recommendation?" "This is me telling you what I'm going to do," he said, "in case it's information you want." She held his gaze for a moment. There was something in her expression that was almost private, not quite accessible, not offered freely, but visible, the way something is visible through glass. "It's information I want," she said. They left the conference room separately, her first, him 5 minutes later. because there was no claim being made, no formal arrangement, no promise extracted or offered. Just two people who had been in the same orbit for 3 years without ever actually meeting, and who had now met, and who were going back out into a city that was the same city it had always been and would not look different on the street level, but was different in the ways that mattered. The quiet ways, the structural ways, the ways that take a long time to see. Damon stood on the sidewalk outside the law firm and looked up at the Manhattan skyline in the specific October light that had been the light on the morning of the divorce papers. And it looked the same as it had looked then. And it looked completely different because he was looking at it differently. He thought about Seraphine pouring the second coffee cup down the drain every morning for 18 months. He thought about a woman who had survived an assassination attempt at 19 and rebuilt herself from nothing in a city that didn't know her name, and who had then spent 3 years in the same apartment as a man who also didn't know her name in the way that actually matters. The interior name, the full one, the name that comes from being seen. He thought about what it costs to be unseen for that long, what it does to the architecture of a person, how they compensate, and what they learn to carry, and what they put down only when someone finally asks them to. He thought about the moment on the aircraft stairs when he had simply gone up them because there was nothing else to do, which had been, possibly, the first entirely unstrategic decision of his adult life. The first thing he had done purely because the alternative, standing on the tarmac watching her go, was simply not something he was capable of doing, not anymore, not after 20 minutes with those financial records and the full, unobstructed understanding of what she had been doing while he was standing at windows. He hailed a cab. He gave the driver the hotel address. On the way, his phone showed a message from a number he had recently saved. 4 words. Coffee tomorrow. My terms. He read it twice. He wrote back 2 words. Name the place. The cab moved through the city, and the city moved around it, ordinary and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small and specific reckonings happening within it, which was the city's way, which was how it had always been. And Damon Cross sat in the back of the cab with his phone in his hand and the particular expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he didn't know he was going, and who finds, now that he's here, that the territory is harder and more honest and more worth navigating than anything he left behind. The skyline moved past the window. He didn't look away from it this time. He looked at all of it, the full thing, the complicated, lit-up, consequential, ordinary thing. And for the first time in a very long time, he actually saw what was there.